Good morning. Sabah al-khair, as we say in my part of the world, and another part also it says Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that at the moment in my part of the world. And I come to you having lived nearly all my adult life in places where we've had conflict, violence, destruction. It's been ongoing, certainly in my little country, Lebanon. The title, as you know, I deliberately picked that title to be provocative. We are very much in a period of transition. It's very much a historical turning point. But as in all cases like that, it's very difficult when you are in the midst of it to understand where you're heading. What I'd like to do with you this morning is three things. I want to talk about the economics of political transitions. I'm an economist by training and by practice. So I'll focus a lot more, but I'm happy to talk about the politics at Q&A. I'll talk about what are the challenges and vulnerabilities facing the countries of the region. And then I want to talk about what are the potential ways out, what are the things that one can do. In particular, what are the game changers? If you look at the post-World War II period, there have been four defining moments. First one, of course, was the end of the British Empire with the Suez Canal crisis, which ended the British Empire that had been known for the previous 150 years. 89, of course, was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union as we'd known it, spawning new republics, new countries emerging. Number three, great financial crisis, 2007, 2008, which ended the American financial empire as we'd known it until then. 2011, I put a question mark, is the Arab Firestorm. It means, in many ways, the end of Sykes-Picot and maybe the end of a post-colonial transition. To my mind, it's very amusing to see the representatives of the UK, the US, and France, as well as Russia, sitting in Geneva, trying to rebuild Syria. I mean, those are exactly the people who were there a previous 100 years ago, designing Sykes-Picot. And of course, there's a beautiful book which I recommend to you with the title, The Peace to End All Peace. And that, of course, is a book by David Fromkin, which I strongly recommend. You can get it online. So we're sitting in a period where much that was put together after the end of the Ottoman Empire is breaking apart. But the Arab economies and the Arab countries face a number of deep challenges. Demographics. They lack good governance. They lack the transparency and the political involvement of people. And much of the attention over the past 3 years that the firestorm has been going on has been on the politics and the governance and security, but it's neglected the economics. And truly you neglect the economics at your peril, because although many of the issues currently ongoing have to do with the politics and governance, a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was no trickle down, that although the economies were growing and were being applauded by the World Bank and the IMF, they didn't create sustainable jobs. Poverty was increasing. And anybody who visited Cairo, I don't know how many of you actually visited it, but if you go from the airport in Cairo to downtown, you go through a very nice suburb quarter called Heliopolis. And that's beautiful villas. And then you go downtown, and as you're going downtown, you pass a cemetery. It's been there about 200 years, 250 years. But it's what I call a living cemetery, because people actually lived there. They actually lived in the mausoleums and the construct. And with time, as Egypt was developing, you not only saw electricity lines, but eventually there were satellite dishes, and it got connected. And you actually got the internet in a grave on the way to downtown. But that illustrated the fact that there wasn't much trickle down in economic growth. And I think the essential point is that we neglect the macroeconomic conditions, the job creation, the fact that if we don't take care, inflation grows, real wages decline, and no jobs get created, and that perpetuates crisis. Looking across the Arab world today, the countries in transitions, we have an acronym today called ACTs, Arab countries in transition. Of course, nobody tells you what they're transitioning towards because we don't know, but it's nice to have that acronym. It's diplomatically correct. The ACTs, macroeconomic conditions have been deteriorating. Growing poverty and unemployment. Every year, some 600,000 young people come into the job market in Egypt. For the past 3 years, of course, no net new jobs got created. So you can easily imagine that you got 1.8 million young people now going into Tahrir Square and saying, what is the future for me? The GCC countries, on the other hand, and it's important to see this contrast, the GCC countries and other oil exporters have benefited from higher oil prices. So in reaction to what was called the Arab Spring, what they've done is they've increased wages and salaries, they've increased subsidies to pacify their populations. And they're able to do so because of the higher oil prices. And of course, part of the higher oil prices is due to the fact that you have the crisis, because there's energy insecurity. And so oil prices tend to rise, and they have more resources to spend. But all these policy responses are just a palliative. They don't address the structural problems that are faced by the Arab countries. And that's what I want to focus on. A couple of graphs. I won't spend too much time on these. But in black, you'll see a comparison of the ACTs with the range of outcomes of other countries, a sample of about 12 countries that have gone through political transitions. The picture, of course, is one typically that output GDP declines, the output gap increases, investment both by the public sector and the private sector declines. And what I want you to see in those graphs is that the black line gives the average for the Arab countries in transition compared to the sample of countries that have gone through transitions in the past. And you'll see it falls pretty much in the middle. I will caution that these do not include Syria because we don't have the numbers. And most likely, once you have Syria included in that sample, it'll look much worse than it actually is in those graphs. But whenever you have these political transitions, you'll typically have unemployment rising. Spending will probably continue at similar levels or even increase in some cases, whereas government revenues decline. And as a result, budget deficits tend to increase, and debt tends to build up. You lose international reserves, and typically, when you're losing international reserves, you'll typically end up into a balance of payments crisis, as Egypt has been experiencing, deterioration of the exchange rate, which then leads to inflation, which exacerbates the problems. So some of the facts that you need to keep at the back of your mind is that, on average, when you have these political crises and transitions, GDP falls by about 4% on average, and takes about 5 years to actually recover. Public and private investment declines by about 20%. That's a large amount. Unemployment rises by 1 to 1.5. So you go, for example, from 7 to 8 and 8.5. Fiscal positions deteriorate. You accumulate debt. And of course, that makes it more difficult to adjust to crises as they develop and unfold. Over time, that is 4 to 5 years, the external accounts start to improve. You start exporting again, and foreign aid or foreign investment starts coming in. What are some of the lessons that we've learned from countries that have gone through conflict? The first is that when you are in conflict, you have to start thinking about what are the policies that can enhance growth and that create jobs. But you also have to look at institutional reform. And so three things I think need to take place. You need to think about what we call growth lifting strategies. I'll mention some of that a bit later. But they also have to be inclusive. That is to say, you need the benefits to go out to everybody in the population, not to a particular segment that has benefited in the past. You also need to remove any dysfunctional institutions. Mohammed Bouazizi, for example, was relatively educated Tunisian. He'd worked in Europe. The first people to get thrown out of a job are the brown-colored ones. When things go bad in Europe, you throw the Algerians, the Moroccans, the Tunisians. They go back home. There's no unemployment. There are no unemployment benefits, no social safety nets. So the young people end up on the streets trying to do whatever job they can find, and there aren't many jobs to find. There are no Unilevers there opening up their doors and saying, please come and work in my factories. So he puts his wheelbarrow out there, goes out, and the policeman says, where's your license for that wheelbarrow? And what are you selling here? And I want a part of it. And eventually, he just immolates himself, right? Despair. And so a lot of those institutions, the corruption, the bribery, needs to be handled. But you need also sound macroeconomic management, because if you don't have that in place, you don't create the jobs, then the situation just deteriorates and the crisis can persist and continue. And you need to strengthen institutional capacity. And one thing that's true of all countries that have gone through political transitions is that the people who take over typically don't have the experience of managing countries and managing governments. And that lack of experience itself means that you don't know how to manage the change. You don't know how to manage transition. So where are we now in terms of the Arab countries? What we know from past political transitions is that macroeconomic outcomes tend to deteriorate. The current performance of Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia, etc., is very much in line with what we've seen in other countries that have gone through transition. The warning here is that we've already had 3 years. It is highly likely, if you just look at the past evidence, that you're probably going to have another 2 to 3 years, if not longer, in terms of the transition. When we talk about an average transition of 4 to 5 years, that's just the average. It can extend even more. In the meantime, the spillover and contagion can spill over into other countries which don't have a crisis. The other major point is that if you look at the political transitions, it is very much unfinished work. Most of the countries are thinking of writing new constitutions and elections. We've had déjà vu new constitutions and elections in Egypt. We're going to have some new ones now. Same is true in Tunisia and other countries, Yemen. Other major point, I think, that you need to retain, there are no military solutions. You don't end these conflicts, typically don't end through one side winning. You don't end through killing the other people. It doesn't work. Or else, if it does temporarily, it just means that the crisis will recur and you'll have more civil conflict down the line. So you only have political trade-offs. The issue is, how do you arrive at a situation where you have negotiation and you have discussions for a political trade-off? Let me talk now about some of the vulnerabilities facing the countries of the region. I deliberately chose, when it first started, the term firestorm, as opposed to the usual term, Arab Spring, because Arab Spring was really very a Eurocentric notion. The Europeans effectively went through their revolutions, coups, etc., and transitions, typically around springtime, right? May, June was when French students and people like you get out there and say, I want to get things changed. And the history of political revolutions in Europe was very much spring. So when it happened in Tunisia, immediately the term Arab Spring came to mind. But that's very Eurocentric. Firestorms, on the other hand, are more descriptive. If you've ever been in a forest when it's been very, very dry, you know that the fire can pick up anywhere in the forest. And it can go from one part of the forest to the other part of the forest very easily. They don't need even to be connected. And when the firestorm ends, some cases it's been so strong that the earth is scorched, nothing ever grows. And in other cases, you have green shoots emerging. We are very much in a firestorm. And I will tell you in advance, I don't have any answers. I don't know whether we're going to end up with a scorched earth or whether we have some green shoots. There are some green shoots, some places, but not too many. Legatum prepares the prosperity index. In black, you've got the MENA countries compared to the rest of the world. If you look at the governance and personal freedom, just about any indicator, look at social capital, they fall way below the average for the world. And remember that the average for the world includes Africa, includes Asia, and Latin America. So although the MENA region is a very prosperous region in terms of natural resources, oil and gas, as well as its population, the performance in terms of the prosperity index is substantially below the average for the rest of the world. Let's dig in a little bit more. There are many fault lines and that is unresolved issues. First, of course, is that what is the role of Islam in politics? Europe, as you know, went through periods where they had many religious wars. And there were many wars that effectively ended by saying, this is the role of religion in the state, and this is how I reach secular societies, and this is the role of the church, effectively. And there was a separation. It took something like 250 years of European history to reach that. We have not had that in the Arab world. We have not designated what is the role of Islam, what is the role of religion, and what is the role of religion in the state. So is it going to be mosque or secularism? That's currently being discussed. Second, the Sunni-Shia schism has been growing. It had been dormant for hundreds of years. It got revived as a result of Western intervention in Iraq. And much of it was deliberate policy. And we can come back to that. Third fault line is the role of the military. In many of the countries of the region, the military and security forces dominate, in fact, the politics. How do you get them out of politics? How do you make that transition? Can we learn of what happened in Latin America and Asian countries that had regimes which were dominated by the military? How do you get them out of politics? There's also the urban-rural divide, very important, I think, in terms of explaining what's happening in the Arab world. If you look at disparities in income and inequality between the urban and rural sectors, they're very large. And the people in rural areas, mainly agricultural, with poor infrastructure, looked at the people in the urban, in the cities, and said, why can't I have that? And why are they privileged and I am not? So the people from Homs and Hama, agricultural and poor, were the people who revolted, as well as people in the north, against what were viewed as privileged people, Sunni, Alawi, you name it, in Damascus. So part of the issue is, when you want to think of resolving the crisis, is what are you going to do about the urban-rural divide? How do you get economic development to spread and involve people? The final one concerns the role of the public sector. For many of the countries, government has always played the driver of economic growth, the driver of economic development. And much of that was built on cheap natural resources, oil and gas, what was deemed to be cheap. How do you get the private sector to be the engine of growth and create the jobs? So I've developed a little index, and I'll show you how it's constructed. It's based on socio-demographic vulnerabilities, political and governance vulnerabilities, and economic vulnerabilities. But let's see how what those types of vulnerabilities are. The first one, what I call the political nightmare, is look at the vertical axis is the fraction of the population below 25. And on the horizontal axis, you've got the youth unemployment rate. So you take a country like Yemen, 65% of the population, 65% of the population is below 25 years of age, and the unemployment rate of those young people is close to 40%. So effectively what you're saying is that half of your population practically and your labor force is out of a job. So if you look at that whole set of countries on the top right-hand side, it's not surprising that you will get revolt. Europe is going through part of it. You haven't had civil unrest on a large scale. It happened in the interwar period. And who knows? We've managed the crisis so far, but you've got ultra-nationalist parties, you've got right-wing parties growing in nearly all the countries in Europe, as well as elsewhere. So this is a nightmare, and the numbers are staggering. We need to create at least 60 to 70 million new jobs by 2020, just to keep the unemployment rate constant. Not to improve it, just to keep it constant. Now, 60 to 70 million is already a large number. But if you realize that there are only currently 110 million jobs existing, then you understand the scale of what needs to be done. So you need to grow by at least 6 to 7%, 8%. You need Chinese growth rates to be able to create the jobs and absorb people out of unemployment. Currently, the transition countries are growing at around 2%. 2%. And therefore, the problem gets exacerbated and grows. Now, of course, when you've got young people, you're supposed to invest heavily in their education, in the human capital. As that chart shows you, on average, the Arab countries spend more on energy subsidies, keeping low oil, fuel prices, etc., than they spend on education. Look at Saudi Arabia, Iran, Algeria, Iraq, just those blue lines are all the pre-tax subsidies. You're not investing in your young people, and therefore, they are not endowed with the skills and the talents that are required to get jobs. On the other hand, you spend lavishly on the military, some of the highest rates of expenditure as a percentage of GDP. That's that mauve, those mauve circles, and the bigger the circle, the more you're spending. And you can see where it's concentrated. But of course, it means that if you're spending a lot on military, and particularly military hardware, as happens in the Gulf, you have less to spend on everything else, in particular on social welfare, safety nets, and all that. Urban-rural divide, I'll leave you that picture. I won't comment too much, but it goes back to my comment that the urban-rural divide is very severe. So 61% of the lagging area populations are within 3 hours from a major city. And they will go to the major city to get things changed. So let me show you a vulnerability index. The MENA plus T, T refers to Turkey. I wanted to have a country which provides a little bit of benchmarking. Those are the underlying factors. This didn't come out of a large econometric exercise. So these are indicators that I felt were important in terms of socio-demographic vulnerability, political and governance, economics, and available for all the countries in the region. So let's see how they rank. The green is the economic vulnerability, red political, blue demographic. Yeah? No surprises at the most vulnerable and the least vulnerable. Most vulnerable countries like Sudan, Djibouti, Yemen, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Iran. Least are the GCC countries, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. But I want you to look at the middle, because that's potentially where the next problems will come about. you already have a problem already in all the countries at the top. Yeah. Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, Saudi. Saudi just as vulnerable, or close to being as vulnerable as in Algeria or in Egypt. Those are middle vulnerability countries. Now, the vulnerability indicator is not saying that you're going to have a problem. It says that there is a predisposition, that there is vulnerability. So if you come from a family that has a long history of cancer and you continue to smoke and drink like there was no tomorrow, then most likely your chances of getting cancer will rise. So the vulnerabilities are that if you have that, you're likely to have problems. So this is very much a period of transformation, but this is not a Berlin Wall period, right? When the Berlin Wall fell, the rest of Europe came to Eastern Europe and said, you are welcome to join the club. This is what is the acquis communautaire. These are the laws, regulations, and institutions if you want to join us. And we will help you. And they created the EBRD, which provided for investment, provided resources. Countries opened up their doors. Germany, the UK, and others allowed Eastern Europeans to come, create jobs. We have none of that. This is not a Berlin Wall moment for the Arab world. And as a result, what it means is that since there is no common vision, there is nothing to look forward to, countries will need to own their own transformations. When the Berlin Wall fell, what you gave those countries is you gave them vision. You said, if you want to become like us, these are the institutions that you need to create, the laws that you need to put in place. We have nothing like that. There's also not only no roadmap, there's also no leadership. No leadership has emerged in any of the countries of the transition to lead, to create a vision, to lead their countries forward. Third, the policy actions that have been taken so far were raising wages, increasing subsidies, but as we shall see in a minute, cutting down on capital spending. So none of those really addressed the structural issues. And if you want to move forward, successful transitions mean you deal with structural reforms, and you need a new development model. And just a little aside, just to lighten the atmosphere on this lack of leadership. Last week, there was a lecture, this is true. There's a lecture given by a hieroglyphics, how do you say it? Whatever, an expert in hieroglyphics, which is ancient pharaonic writing. Anyway, he picks up a text, apparently newly discovered text, and he's interpreting the text, and it's in Arabic. And the text he translates, he says, Unzur, unzur, see, and the question before is, who will rule Egypt, is the question in the papyrus. And it continues to say, Unzur, unzur. And the lecturer, to an audience not too dissimilar to this, says, unzur, unzur, but you have to think of the English translation. It's see. And nobody laughed. So here was this supposed expert telling them that it's written on papyrus of 3,000 years old that Sisi is going to be ruling Egypt. And nobody in the audience even questioned. Whoops. Seem to be going back. I thought I was going forward. I seem to be going back. Okay. Question, Q&A already? No. But I've got 10 transformations I need to get to. As a result of all this, extremism is spreading certainly faster than democracy across the Arab world. So in answer to the question I asked, if I were to stop right now and say, where do we stand? it is more extremism and stagnation and not reform and growth. And the spillovers from Syria are growing, not least in my own little country, Lebanon. My favorite philosopher is John Gray. I'll just quote that little phrase at the end. We've come to believe a story in which freedom is the natural human condition, which only tyrants prevent everyone from enjoying. The reality is, when a tyrant is toppled, we don't know. We can't know what will come next. And typically, you get another tyrant. So let me go, you'll have the presentation anyway. But there are three challenges facing the Arab countries in transition. Job creation, and how do you pull up people out of poverty and get development to trickle down? Second, you need to remove subsidies, reduce subsidies. Egypt spends 12% of GDP on food and fuel subsidies. Aish, which is bread, is so cheap that it's fed to the animals. And when it's no longer good for the animals, you then put water on it and you use it as plaster for the walls. You cannot continue. And untargeted subsidies mainly help the rich and not the poor. You need to do something about the ease of doing business. They rank very poorly in terms of the cost of doing business. So, 5 game changers, as I see it. One is you need a massive program of infrastructure spending to create jobs. I call them weapons of mass peace, as opposed to the WMDs. Every 10 billion that you can spend on infrastructure creates 1 million new jobs. Second, you need a security arrangement. It's a security arrangement which includes the GCC countries, plus Iran, which is one, or you widen it to include Iraq and Pakistan. That's what you need. Third, the GCC countries, which are the engine of growth in the Arab world, need to think of having regional free trade agreements for the countries in transition, and maybe establish a neighborhood policy. At the moment, they're giving aid, but unconditionally. So the Egyptians come, cap in hand, and you give them $12 billion. They go back, they're very happy. No reform, nothing happens, and you just continue. 4, empowerment of women. I'll take 2 minutes to focus on that. And 5, the big game changer is détente with Iran, which is probably the only thing I believe which can maybe change things in our region. To implement the infrastructure investment policy, and you need massive amounts. If you look at the countries that got destroyed, Iraq needs some 700 billion. To my count, Syria to date needs about 250 billion for reconstruction. So if you look at just reconstruction expenditure, that's over 1 trillion. And if you look at how much underinvestment has taken place in other countries, you probably need another trillion. So we're talking about $2 trillion. If you had that, massive change, not only in the region, but also globally. For that, I think you need an Arab Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We're the only region in the world that doesn't have that. But women is the critical bit, to my mind. We have the lowest female labor force participation rates of any region in the world. And I love that picture from UNICEF. But women not only don't engage themselves in the labor force, on top of that, they have the highest educational attainment rates and the highest unemployment rates. So you educate them more and you tell them to stay at home. Now, if you change that, here's a table. If you plug the gap between the male and female labor force participation rate in Saudi Arabia, 76% for males, 18% for females. If you plugged 50% of that by 2030, the growth rate in Saudi Arabia would rise to 8.45% per year. And if you plugged 100% by 2030, growth rate of 9.47%. Those are game changers. And of course, Iran. You cannot resolve conflicts in the region without involving Iran. So that's a big game changer. I'll leave you those. Those are my favorite 10 transformations that need to take place. Different people have different lists. I didn't list them in any particular order. But if you want to address the crises, if you want to deal with the deep structural issues that we have, the demographics, the poverty, the corruption, the bribery, that has to be on the list. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we now have time for 3 questions from the audience. If you'd like to put your hands up.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on the sort of Sunni-Shia divide in Iraq and how you think that was caused by the West and why it was caused by the West. Just a bit more about that.
Well, when the coalition of the willing, I think they called it, basically US, UK, plus a couple of others came in, they didn't realize, because they didn't understand the history of the region, they didn't understand Iraq, and destroyed Saddam Hussein's regime. Effectively, what it meant was that Iran was the biggest winner of all, and of course the Shia, who had been discriminated against by Saddam Hussein. When the realization finally came that they had no understanding of how to build nations as opposed to how to destroy nations, the rest of the Gulf, the Sunni Gulf, discussed with the Americans, well, what do we do about this? And the main thing was, how do I get opposition to the Shia moving? And the only way to do that is to revive a Sunni Shia, very ancient, 1,500 years old, divide. And that was deliberately done and financed. So if you look at when the troubles between Sunni and Shia started, that's the origin. You didn't have that before. What I'm saying is deliberate policy. And you're now living the consequences. The trouble is that once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And you've got Al-Qaeda and Judd al-Sham and Jund al-Islam and Nusra. I mean, who knows who these are? But they're spreading and uncontrollably.
Thank you very much for the speech, Dr. Saidi. You mentioned that Arab governments spend a great deal of money on energy subsidies. Why do you think they do this? Do they want to short-term buy their populations into submission for basically, buying their, I don't know, like patience to them?
It's an alternative. It's a cheap way to have a so-called safety net, right? You give electricity subsidies, you get fuel subsidies, you get food subsidies. But lots of it is fuel-based, because fuel is a local natural resource. So it's viewed as being cheap. The trouble is that all the subsidies are not targeted. So for example, if you look at Egypt, it's been calculated that 80% of the subsidies go to the 20% richest part of the population. When you have untargeted subsidies, that's exactly what happens. What you need to do is to target the subsidies to reach the people whom you truly want to help. Second, of course, it's a political device. I recall I did 2 visits to Iraq the time I was a minister. I went there because we had to improve our trade relations between Lebanon and Iraq. I learned very much about what they had in terms of a family food program. Each family had a little book which allowed it to buy a couple of kilos of rice, maybe 1 kilo of meat, sugar, tea, etc. per month. But you had to buy it from a designated shop in a particular neighborhood. It did not work anywhere else. So that meant that they controlled the movement of the population. You could not go from one part of the city to the other without their permission. And second, your rights could be abolished if you didn't behave. So this was an instrument of political control, right? If you don't have that little booklet, you lose out, right? So these are very much instruments of political control and widely used.
One last question.
I'm not in control of who gets chosen, so.
Hello. Sabah al-khair. Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask, you talked about maybe creating a bank, but what about, for example, the Arab League that has been existing for a long time and they don't seem to be doing anything?
The Arab League, of course, has been, well, let's look a little bit of history. In 1953, the Arab countries got together, even before the Europeans and the Treaty of Rome in 1956, to create a common market. And they created these pan-Arab institutions, including the Arab League. But it's become a totally dysfunctional organization, effectively run by bureaucrats who are very pleased to get their salaries.
Very expensive.
Are very pleased to get their salaries, but don't do anything else. The Arab League is a political body. People go there to shout at each other, occasionally to negotiate, but totally dysfunctional. I lived it. However, an Arab Bank for Reconstruction is a totally different thing. If you look at the extent of underinvestment that has taken place, we need, given the fast-growing population, we have some of the youngest and fastest-growing populations in the world. I mentioned the urban-rural divides, so therefore you need to invest in infrastructure in the rural areas. The estimate is that you need about 110 billion each year of investment in infrastructure. Current level of investment is around 40 billion. So there's a gap of about 70 billion, which is not being filled per year. So you need an institution that will come in and effect that. So the proposition is straightforward. The GCC countries are sitting on international reserves at the level of China, something like 3.6 trillion of international reserves. The bulk of them are invested in US Treasury bills paying less than half of 1%. What you need to do is to take a very, very small fraction of that. I estimate the capital requirement for an Arab bank at around 50 billion. You put that in place, that Arab Bank for Reconstruction helps rebuild countries that have been destroyed by war and violence, provides for regional infrastructure, provides for long-term loans for economic development. We need to put that in place as quickly as possible. So instead of the Deauville Partnership, I'm sure you're familiar with the Deauville Partnership, been in place something like 3 years now. All it has to show for itself is that they met. And they meet in the nicest of places. They don't meet in the region, of course. They meet in Paris, London, and elsewhere because it's nice and convenient. And nice communiques come out as a result of that. But that's it. The total commitment so far is about $250 million. I can assure you that per day, the number of missiles, shots, and bullets, and whatever else is worth multiples of that. So what you need to do is now start focusing on the economics as opposed to the military and the politics. So at least you're promising people that they can have a better future. And so put that on the table. And I think putting together an institution such as an Arab Bank for Reconstruction means that you give some hope that you're moving towards collective action. We have had no collective action. Arab League, not present. United Nations, not present. European countries, I wish they weren't present. We've had enough disasters. We've had Iraq, we've had Afghanistan, we have Syria, we've had Libya, and the list goes on. They know how to destroy. They have no notion about nation building. And I think the moment has come to say the truths as they are. We don't want more wars. We don't want any military, so-called military solutions. Look at the disaster in Libya. It's coming apart. It's very nice. You bomb, you think you get rid of a tyrant. But what have you put in place? Nobody liked Gaddafi. He was crazy. And we all knew that. But you need to think about what you do about the transition. What comes after? What do you put in place? They went into Iraq, and within a few months, some bright guy said, well, we'll abolish the army. So they disbanded the Iraqi army, which had something like 2.3 million members, right? Automatically out of a job, but knowing how to use a gun. So you automatically created enemies to the tune of 2.5 million, plus their members of the family, right? So 8 million people were automatically against you. Then you wonder why things go bad. I saw little articles coming out you know, democracy on the Tigris, right? Texas on the Tigris. I mean, these are ignoramuses. I mean, they came there, no notion of the history of civilization. They parked their tanks on Babylon. They destroyed Babylonian cities. They had no inkling. They're destroying our civilization, our history, our culture is being destroyed. And it just gets dismissed. And the trouble is that people don't realize that this will come back and haunt them. There are now estimated to be some 8,000 Europeans and over 2,000 people from the UK are now fighting in Syria. Maybe some good portion of them will get killed, but many others will come back. What do you do with them? How do you deal with extremism? Do you send a missile? No. When you send a missile and you kill 5 people, you automatically create 25 who hate you. So we have to start doing things differently than we've done so far. This is really a turning point. And that's why I called it a defining moment. I mean, and I don't know how it's going to end.
Thank you.
Thank you.